And I used to see him even after retirement. He had only one bedroom flat in Hyderabad. After being chief minister and minister, that's all he had. Utterly honest, very simple and remarkable chief minister.
Yeah.
Jay Bengal.
Right.
So you're right, Andhra Pradesh had a distinction for a great chief minister of India.
So we'll start now. It's 5 o'clock.
Ready.
Hello and welcome to this discussion at the Pune International Center Policy Research Think Tank on Dr. Sanjaya Baru's latest book, India's Power Elite, Class, Caste and a Cultural Revolution. I am Abhay Vaidya, Associate Director, Pune International Center. We are indeed honored to have with us the eminent author, Dr. Sanjaya Baru, for this discussion with one of India's leading political scientists, Professor Suhas Palshikar. Dr. Baru is Distinguished Fellow, United Services Institution of India. He has been editor of India's major financial newspapers, The Economic Times, Financial Express, and Business Standard. As is well known, he was media advisor to Prime Minister Shri Manmohan Singh. Among other high positions held, Dr. Baru was member of India's National Security Advisory Board in 1999-2000, member of the governing board of the Center for Policy Research and director for Geoeconomics and Strategy, International Institute of Strategic Studies, London. He was professor of economics at the University of Hyderabad, Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, and the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, Singapore. Dr. Baru is founder trustee of the Forum for National Security Studies, India, and visiting faculty, Indian School of Public Policy. He has written a number of books, notably The Accidental Prime Minister, The Making and Unmaking of Manmohan Singh, and in 2016, a book on Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao titled 1991, How P.V. Narasimha Rao Made History. The latest book from Dr. Baru is as well a book on the third Prime Minister, but more on the politics of Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the shift in the power elite that has taken place. A warm welcome to you, Dr. Baru.
Thank you.
We are also honored to have with us one of India's leading political scientists, political analysts, and commentators, Professor Suhas Palshikar, who had delivered the 10th Foundation Lecture at the PIC last September on majoritarianism and the future of democratic politics in India. Professor Palshikar is director of the Lok Niti Program for Comparative Democracy of the Center for Study of Developing Societies. He was professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at the Savitribai Phule Pune University from 1989 to 2016 and is the chief editor of the journal Studies in Indian Politics, an international peer-reviewed journal brought out by SAGE. Professor Palshikar has assisted in a number of national and state elections. In the study of a number of national and state elections, his books include The Last Fortress of Congress Dominance, Maharashtra since the 1990s, Politics and Society Between Elections, and Understanding the Downslide of India's Democracy, among others. Welcome, Professor Palshikar.
Thank you.
I shall now hand over the floor to Professor Palshikar for his opening remarks, followed by an introduction to the book by Dr. Baru, leading to a question and answer session moderated by Dr. Palshikar. You are welcome to post your questions in the chat box. Dr. Palshikar, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you and good afternoon to everyone. It's a great pleasure to be in conversation with Dr. Sanjaya Baru. Not so much because of the accidentally famous book that he has written, but also because of the other work that he has been continuously doing. And particularly this book that we are going to discuss this evening about the changes or whether there are changes or not in India's power elite is something that should interest not only scholars or academicians or journalists, but everyone who is interested in this question of social transformation, democratization. Is India's democracy changing? Are we having something new happening around us contemporarily? These are the questions. Anyone who is interested in these questions should be reading this book. I would not anticipate what he is going to say much, because he is going to introduce the book. But at the same time, as I have promised him, I would raise some questions about the book. And in order for me to raise these questions, let me first put in perspective what the book is doing. In a sense, the book is about the resilience and transformation also, but I would put that transformation part into brackets. It's more about the resilience of India's ruling classes. He, of course, uses an imposing framework of Searite mills, and that is also the title of the book, about the power elite. This concept of power elite, and in fact, overall work of Searite mills, sometimes gets sidetracked, but has very important lessons for any student of both political science as well as sociology. In fact, anyone who is interested in questions of power should be looking at Searite mills. And you may correct me, Dr. Baru, but I thought that you might have picked up on this particular framework, probably because Wright Mills himself sort of combines the Marxian and the Weberian insights in his writings. And one of the questions that your book raises probably is this, and it's also answered implicitly, is this, that the different power hierarchies sort of intersect, and the intersections constitute the power elite. And therefore, apparently someone who is not politically influential is actually very powerful politically and socially as well. For those who are conversant with these debates, they might be reminded of a very old, almost 3 decades old question that Francine Frankel had raised about the dissonance between social dominance and state power in the Indian context. And we might now be revisiting that question as to whether there has been so much of dissonance, or increasingly social dominance and state power are sort of merging and overlapping with each other. More recently, however, and one can read these books together in order to understand what this particular book is doing and what its contribution is. There has been a work by Christophe Jaffarlo and Sanjay Kumar on the changing composition of India's representatives. It's more about state level representatives, but all the same, the question is whether that is changing, to what extent, and their emphasis, of course, is more on the caste composition of these representatives. Similarly, what Dr. Baru's book also refers to is a work by Harish Damodaran, who talks of the new capitalists. So in a sense, it is this book which brings together these missing threads and tells us about not just changes in the political representatives, not just changes in those who hold the economic reins of the country, but probably much more than that, changes in the power grid in which India's democracy, in a sense, operates. And the question probably this book raises is, has there been a transformation after all, or is it only cosmetic? Things are changing, and more things change, the more they look the same or similar. Is that the case with the power elite in India? Or are we truly witnessing a transformation of India's power elite? I will reserve some of the comments only for purposes of rounding off the discussion at the end. But before I hand over to Dr. Baru to introduce the book and then maybe respond to some of the anticipated questions, I would be failing in my duty if I did not quarrel with you, Dr. Baru, and begin asking some questions that you might as well have already answered in various other events of discussion on this book. something that we were informally discussing with, and let me come straight to that first. I thought that there is an awkwardness in the book about making sense of the Modi moment. And therefore, probably the book is wrongly seen, not your fault perhaps, but the book is seen as saying that Modi has brought the transformation. I don't know whether Modi has brought that transformation. B, whatever transformation you and your book allude to was already in process. Probably it is a response to what Mandal and Market were doing since the 90s. Bajpayee himself presided over some of these changes. Vishwanath Pratap Singh presided over some of the other changes. And therefore, in our haste to give credit, or in our eagerness to critique Modi, we probably give too much credit, as if Modi consciously brought certain changes. My question, therefore, would be about this part. Is Modi presiding over certain changes that were already in process, taking sources from those changes, or is he actually the architect of these changes? I thought that your book tries to reach up to this question, and in the last few pages, in the concluding chapter, you actually talk about some of these things, but most of the things that you talk about are in question marks rather than answers, and that's why I'm raising this. Related to this, let's probably go back a little bit and ask about the genealogy of these changes that we talk of today, because they are dramatic today, because we see those changes today. Let's take just one example to explain the point that I am making. Was it not in the times of the super elite, the elite of elite, probably Jawaharlal Nehru, that Kamraj became not only the chief minister of a very important state, replacing Rajgopalachari, but also subsequently became the president of the Congress party. In a sense, this process of intervention of a non-English but non-Hindi speaking leader, a leader from the south, and his crashing into the Delhi lot was very significant in terms of the power that our democracy holds on the one hand, the reconciliation with these changes that our elite would also always have, and therefore Nehru sort of reconciles with these, and there were many others. I am just giving Kamraj as one example. And therefore, if we replace our gaze from lieutenants and replace our gaze from Delhi, then probably we would realize that this was already in the making. The only thing, of course, is that 1990s sort of bring that into sharper focus. And therefore, why not we look at it as a continuity, as a continuum. And once you look at it as a continuum, you can then give enough emphasis to Mr. Lalu Prasad and Mr. Mulayam Singh as well. I might be wrong, but I thought I didn't find any reference to them. And therefore, in the changes, not only in the composition, but the English-speaking elite's attitude to the likes of Mulayam Singh and Lalu Prasad, they both have done something very dramatic, and it is very doubtful whether Modi could have happened without them. And that's why I'm bringing this in. Well, anyway, there could be many more questions, but I would just stop here by making a final comment, which is about two things. One is, in fact, and therefore it's a double comment. Your book does speak about changes in the field of our cultural elite generally. And yet I thought that that is something more interesting and something that we should go into deep, because that is where changes should have happened and changes are happening now. There has been some discussion of how from the Kapil Dev moment, India's cricket team sort of changed its composition from the likes of Pataudi and the English-speaking elite playing the gentleman's game to now the small-town boys and girls playing cricket, etc. There has been some discussion also about the elite in the entertainment industry who have changed. What do they actually do is something we just don't know. A Virat Kohli or a Kangana Ranaut is not just a successful player or cine personality. They also become symbols, and we probably miss, because of our emphasis either on economics or politics, the power of these symbolic personalities which emerge and which keep emerging in our midst. The final thing is not a comment on your book, actually, it's a question for all of us. Like the military industrial complex that both Sir Wright Mills and Eisenhower mentioned, what kind of a new nexus, what kind of a new chain and grid of power is probably emerging around us today, which, for example, and I'm just giving this an example, so forgive me for examples, for example, which allows the mixing of a Patanjali with the politics of the country. It is this nexus that is probably changing, and therefore, in spite of the fact that the elites don't change, probably the composition of the nexus and therefore internal equilibrium among the power elite is probably changing. But I will stop here because these are enough to sort of provoke some of our audience also to then take up those questions further and for you to respond apart from introducing the book. Please take your time because, as I said earlier also, I don't now need more than a couple of minutes to make my so-called concluding observations. So depending upon how many questions we can take, but at the moment, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Palshikar. It's such a delight. As I said to you before this discussion began, I'm a great admirer of your columns. And therefore, I was delighted that you actually read my book. Thanks to Pune International Center for forcing you to read my book. And you've raised some very, very interesting questions. So before I come to your questions, and I'll come to all of them as I go along, let me say briefly about something about the book. First of all, I have been fascinated by the nature of power and the way it functions. Having lived in Delhi now for 30 years, I came from Hyderabad to Delhi in 1990, and I've been here now for 21 years. And I've had also the opportunity of being briefly in government. So as a witness to the functioning of power and power systems, I was always interested in trying to articulate some of the changes that I see happening. As I begin the book by saying that I, as a student of, as an undergraduate student at the Nizam College in Hyderabad, I read Sir Wright Mills. And I was profusely impressed by his writing. But I read two other great scholars whom I refer to in my book. One is Bertrand Russell, who wrote a fascinating book on the nature of power. And the second, of course, is Antonio Gramsci, who's in his prison notebooks has an elaborate discussion on power and the concept of hegemony. So as someone who's read Mills, Gramsci and Russell, I've always been interested in trying to understand how power works in India. And that is where I come from. I'm not a student of political science. I'm not a student of politics. My basic training was in economics, and in the last 30 years, I've been in the media. But many of these ideas in my book really go back to these three writers, to Mills, to Russell, and to Gramsci. But the fourth person who deeply influenced me was Ram Manohar Lohia. Reading Lohia, I really began to ask myself, why has Lohia been so underestimated? Why is his influence in the public discourse not as important as it should be? There was a moment when Lohia was important, and Dr. Palshikar mentioned Mulayam Singh, Lalu, they were all students of Ram Manohar Lohia intellectually. They were the products of Lohia socialism. And yet we do not see the presence of Ram Manohar Lohia in a lot of our public discourse. But if you go back to some of his seminal writings, particularly his conceptualization of the Indian elite, where he identifies three characteristics: uh, inherited wealth, upper class status, and command of the English language or education in the English language. He says these are the three elements that define India's power elite. And he was talking of the Nehruvian elite. So my starting point was all of this. Having read all these great scholars and having read Lohia, I said, let me try and understand what is happening today. Interestingly, the first three chapters I wrote were in fact in the book. If you look at the contents of the book, they are not the first three chapters in the book. They are the fourth and fifth chapter. The chapter on social dominance and state power, which you referred to, Dr. Palshikar, Francine Frankel, and M.S.A. Rao's work, trying to understand the distinction between dominance and power. The chapter on ideas of Wilfred Pareto, Max Weber, Moscha, and other writers on the concept of power elite. I began with theory and then went on to look at the power structures in India. As I finished that manuscript, and my publishers, some of them, not the publisher, but a couple of editors, looked at the manuscript. I think there was a certain feeling that if I could only contextualize the book in what is happening today, it would have a wider readership. So as I said to you before we began this conversation, I then decided to use Narendra Modi as the peg on whom I hang the book. So the first and second chapter, which are about Modi, were actually written much later. They were not, the writing did not begin with the first two chapters. Actually, the writing ended with the first two chapters. And then I thought, this is enticing the average reader to come into the book because Modi sells. And certainly, Modi gave us fantastic quotations for the book. I mean, his whole statement on Lutyens Delhi and how he was not adopted by Lutyens Delhi, his rejection of Lutyens Delhi, or what he called the Khan Market gang, and Rahul Gandhi's attack on him, saying he's the suit boot ki sarkar. All of those quotations, which I've used liberally in the beginning, offer the current political context in which Modi becomes the symbol of an attack on the old elite, represented by the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty and the family and everything that came along with them. So what I tried to do in the book is to say that here was a pre-existing power elite that survived political transition, that came into being during the leadership of Jawaharlal Nehru and became stronger through the Indira and the Rajiv era, and did not actually suffer any setback during the regimes of Atal Bihari Vajpayee. And as I've argued in the book, Vajpayee's whole strategy was to adopt this elite rather than to reject them. And of course, I saw myself firsthand the re-strengthening, the reassertion of this elite during Manmohan Singh's time, the return of the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty, if you like. And when I talk about the dynasty, etc., I'm not only referring to the family, I'm referring to the entire paraphernalia. So if you see, for example, in the chapter on business, there are businessmen whom we associate with that era. There are cultural leaders. There's a media. And I refer to the fact that the India Today was launched in the midst of the emergency, today being the anniversary of the emergency, is useful to recall, as a defender of the emergency, the India Today. Just as Arnab Goswami is there in Republic TV as a defender of Modi. So you had and NDTV, of course, under Pranay, very much pro-Gandhi and closely linked with the Congress party. So you had a wider elite that was under attack, thanks to Narendra Modi. So that offers me the kind of political context for the larger argument about the transition. Then I come to the transition. I'm not getting into the theoretical discussion. As I said, I have 2 chapters that look at some of these concepts, but that was only meant, since I'm not a student of political science, that was meant to satisfy my friends in political science that, look, I've read a little bit of Weber, I've read a little bit of Pareto, I've read a little bit of the literature, so I'm not that ignorant of the political science literature. So those chapters were written to make the point. But that's not the focus of the book. The focus begins with, in fact, the 4th or 5th chapter, where I call it the structure, the wielders of power. So business, landed elements, political elite, bureaucracy, intellectuals, etc., etc. There, let me summarize my argument before I move on to the questions raised by Professor Palshikar. My argument basically is that in each of these realms, we see a transition. First of all, I start off from the characterization of the elite by C. Wright Mills, where Wright Mills identifies in the United States the big business, the military industrial complex, the political elite, and Hollywood and the cultural elite as the wielders of power. And I argue that if you look at India, the main difference between the structure of the wielders of power as compared to what C. Wright Mills writes about is that, one, the permanent bureaucracy in India is an extremely important institution of power, which is not the case in the United States. And two, that the military industrial complex, which he writes about, has not yet come into being. In my view, as I end the book, towards the end, I make the point that it is probably coming into being now with the privatization of defense production, etc. We will at some point have a military industry complex. But in the United States, those of you who are familiar with the history know that it was during the, essentially during the interwar period, that the military industrial complex came into being. And it is this military industry complex that not only benefited from the Second World War and supplied armaments to both to allies in Europe and Asia, but at the end of the war, then became extremely powerful and continues to remain powerful today as the wielders of power in the US. Now, in India, that has not yet happened, but we have the big business. Then I look at the transition in the business elite, the transition from the pre-91 era to the post-91 era. And there is a transition. We have to recognize that, you mentioned Professor Palshikar, Harish Damodaran's book. In fact, I wrote a paper in 1985, which in fact Harish begins by quoting. And his book was kind of taking off from that paper of mine, which I published in a book edited by Francine Frankel and Rajiv Bhargav, which looks at the rise of the regional business. And my argument at that time in the 80s was that the consequence of the Green Revolution in states where the Green Revolution had an impact, like Punjab, Haryana, Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, etc., and the consequence of agrarian change was that a very powerful business class emerged out of the agriculture, and you had the kind of traditional Marxist, if you like, evolution of agrarian capitalism into industrial capitalism in some parts of the country. And the end of the license permit Raj in 1991 actually benefited this group. So I make the point that if you look at the top 100 companies in India in 1960, 70, 80, 90, 2000, then there's hardly any change in the period 60s, 70s, 80s. The same Birla, Tata, Singhania, Shriram, Goenkas, Kanorias, the Marwadi, Parsi business groups dominate the Indian business. But through the 90s, you have Mittal, Munjal, Ambani himself, of course, and then Infosys and Premji and a whole lot of business groups entering the top. So that transition that the liberalization of 91 facilitated does mark a change. And there is increasing competition between regional business and national business. And I give some examples like the way in which the Rajus in Andhra Pradesh fought for their license against the Birlas and used their access to Rajiv Gandhi through Kothrochi to get that license, etc. Second transition is in the bureaucracy itself. an upper caste bureaucracy, both in pre-colonial and colonial period, begins to transform as the upper classes go increasingly out of government service into private sector or go abroad. The backward classes come increasingly into, and particularly from northern India. So the bureaucracy sees a transformation. The third transformation is in the agrarian countryside, with the decline of the old feudals and the rise of the new agrarian rich. And that is a transition we are seeing working out even today as the farmers' agitation shows. So in each of these areas, you see a transition. And of course, in the world of education, in the world of intellectual activity also, we see this transition. You are absolutely right that I don't focus on culture, the sport and entertainment. And yes, in fact, that remark has been made by several others. It's certainly a chapter waiting to be written. Partly lack of familiarity, lack of resources, and the fact that most of this book was written during COVID, lockdown, sitting at home, where the only library I had access to was the India International Center, which fortunately was open through a lot of the period. But apart from the internet and but anyway, I think you're absolutely right that what is happening in the field of sport is important. Now, to come to some of the points you make, the first and the important point you make about Kamaraj and the rise of the regional political leadership in India. The way I have tried to deal with this is to make a distinction between transition at the state level and transition at the national level. The Nehrus who controlled Delhi and the Nehru-Gandhi Darbar, I call it the Darbar, it was. There is no question about it. It was inheritance. I mean, I make a point. At one point in the 1970s, there was an IAS officer, and I can mention his name here, I don't mention it in the book, S. Santanam. He was a senior official, government's IAS officer in Andhra Pradesh cadre, did a study to show how all the important jobs in Delhi went to the sons or sons-in-law of ICS officers. In 1970s, the ICS was still around. So whether in the foreign service or in the administration, so it was very much within the family, the bureaucracy. That is no longer the case because now the sons of those powerful IAS officers, they're all abroad. You know. In fact, if you look today, I think almost the entire top leadership of this country, the second generation, is not in India, in the bureaucratic leadership, probably even the political leadership. But there is a transition even in bureaucracy in terms of caste composition. The Delhi Darbar was very much in the control of an elite that remained in power. Kamarajas may come and Kamarajas may go. Charan Singh came, Charan Singh went. You know, there were other people in other parts of the country. Of course, in the Kerala and Bengal, you had the left. You had Sukhadia in Rajasthan. A lot of regional leaders went through periods of great power. But when they went beyond a certain level, Delhi kicked them. Brahmanand Reddy, a brilliant example of a Reddy, powerful Reddy chief minister who was becoming so big that Indira Gandhi cut him to size by trying to launch the separate Telangana agitation in '69 and bringing P.V. Narasimha Rao and bringing Anjaya and moving the Reddys out of politics. Similarly, in Karnataka, Devaraj Ars was brought in, remove Nijalingappa. In Maharashtra, you see, and Maharashtra finally Sharad Pawar had to leave the party. But in across the country, the Delhi Darbar allowed these regional, powerful regional elements to come up to a point, as long as they did not challenge the Nehru-Gandhi family. And my argument is that era is over. And in fact, in my view, and day after tomorrow happens to be the centenary of P.V. Narasimha Rao. One of the major crimes of Narasimha Rao, which political scientists have not yet understood and analyzed, and I would urge you to look at it, is the way in which he was actually strengthening these regional elements within the Congress party. In order to strengthen himself, of course, but at the cost of the Darbar, the Delhi Darbar. So those around Sonia Gandhi were being marginalized, which is why at some point the Congress broke up. Natwar Singh, Sheila Dikshit, N.D. Tiwari, all the Darbaris were moved out and tried to break the party. But that transition within the Congress began during Narasimha Rao's time and then was pulled back with Sonia taking over the party. and controlling the party. And now, once again, what we are seeing in the Congress is this tension between a Delhi Darbar and the regional potentates, whether it's Mamata Banerjee, who's a Congress leader in Bengal, or a Sharad Pawar, or a Jagan Reddy. All these are congressmen. So this battle between regional leaders and the Delhi Darbar has happened in the Congress over a long period of time. So that did not alter the nature of the power elite in Delhi. What alters the nature of the national power elite is really the hammering it is receiving from the Hindutva, and that is where Modi comes in. I think what Modi has brought in is a completely new power base into the bureaucracy, into academia, into the cultural space. I mean, you talk about Kangana Ranaut, these are all agents of the BJP. And so BJP is now, the campaign against Muslims in Bollywood, which I refer to in the book briefly. What is it? It is essentially the BJP trying to enter the cultural space, enter Bollywood. Finally, the point you make about the absence of Lalu and Mulayam. Yeah, first of all, I'm not that familiar with the politics of Northern India. As you see from the book, I'm sure you'll realize that most of my examples come from Southern India. Because I'm more familiar with Andhra, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra. I'm not that familiar, having lived in Delhi all these years, with the forces at play in Bihar or UP. But at the same time, I do mention in the book that I see what has happened in UP, Bihar as part of the rise of the middle class. And that brings me to the final point, which the emergence of the backward caste, OBCs, constitutes an important power shift. It first begins with the weakening of the Congress and the rise of these regional leaders, whether it's Mulayam or Lalu, but is now incorporated into the BJP. The BJP's rise in the last 6 years has been at the cost of Lalu, Mulayam, and the other backward caste leaders, as the BJP integrates backward caste into its base. And today you can see the tension in UP between the old BJP, which is the Brahmins and the Kayasthas, and the new BJP, which is the Rajputs and the backward castes. And how the BJP will manage this is not clear. In fact, I think the problems for the BJP will begin with this. All of us focus on the Hindu majoritarianism of the BJP, but we don't focus enough on the internal caste battles that are happening in every single state under BJP leadership. And in fact, BJP has as much of an internal caste battle as any other political party, whether it's the Congress or other parties. And I do discuss this in the book. I do think that the emergence of the backward caste. So finally, let me end by saying, we go back to Ramanohar Lohia, inherited wealth, upper caste, English language. And I conclude by saying that all three are less important today. Inherited wealth is no longer the main source of wealth. What is the main source of wealth? It is the concentration of political and economic power. The biggest businessmen are the politically most powerful businessmen. The biggest politicians are the biggest wielders of wealth. Every major politician is today a businessman across most parties. And every businessman is linked to a politician. So the complete, it's a plutocracy. I do use the word plutocracy. What you see is an integration of business and politics at the top, state after state. And often the battles between political parties are battles between businessmen. So inherited wealth is no longer as important as acquired wealth. Wealth acquired through political control or political influence. Caste, it is no longer the upper caste. It's only in UP that the Brahmins are still fighting. But across the country, backward castes have become dominant in politics. And finally, English language. In the case of the English language, first of all, it's no longer that important for power. It is certainly important for wealth, because the entire private sector deals only in the English language. And what is curious is the assertion of the Dalits demanding access to the English language. And I think that's one thing Ramanohar Lohia did not anticipate, that rather than rejecting English, my friend and classmate Kancha Ailaya, we were together in Nizam College and Usmania University many years ago, has been one of the vociferous defenders of teaching English to the Dalit community, saying if the upper caste can globalize through the English language, why can't we globalize through the English language, right? So there is a demand for English language education. And since the government for political reasons is not providing it in most of the country, except in a few places like Andhra Pradesh, where now the state government has introduced teaching of English in government schools. Across the country, there is still this kind of populist politics of instruction in the mother tongue. Even the poor are going to private schools. I see it in Delhi. The number of people from poorer families who are sending their children to English medium schools. So the English language continues to be important, though in the world of politics, it is not at all important. In politics, the language of power is Hindi. Let me end with this brief remark that when Manmohan Singh became Prime Minister, he can't read Hindi. He can only read Urdu or Gurmukhi. And therefore, all his speeches had to be written either in Gurmukhi or Urdu, but using some Hindi words. But some of the Hindi purists objected to this. They said, what is this? Your Prime Minister of India can't read Hindi. So this Hindi fundamentalism is being increasingly asserted. BJP is called Hindi party. So when it comes to language, in state after state, in Tamil Nadu it's Tamil, in Kerala it's Malayalam, in Andhra it's Telugu, Bengal it's Bengali. So there is a certain assertion of the local language by the political elements in power. But among the Dalits, there is growing demand for the English language. I think I've spoken now for almost half an hour. Let me stop here. It's a very fine audience, I know, for the Pune International Center. I'm quite happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. I'm sure it does answer the questions, and at the same time, our audience would have many more questions on this now. I will start reading out some of the questions, and maybe one by one, if they're related, you can take them together. You made mention about this today being the day of declaration of emergency. And here is a question following from that. Mr. Vikas Apte has asked this question in the context of today being the day on which emergency was declared. The question to Dr. Baru is, how do you foresee survival of democracy vis-a-vis politics of belligerence of state versus center? And he gives examples of West Bengal, Kerala, Maharashtra, etc. So that's a question, though not on the question of power elite themselves. The other interesting question is on this elite emerging through the digital social media ecosystem. I think this is a question by Mr. Vilas Rajwade. Emergence of millennial elite, especially in digital and social media ecosystem, the pressure group that they form and leverage their clout to change public mood and discourse. How far-reaching this will be in the decade of the 2020s. So I think we shall begin with these two questions at a time, maybe. Ajit Ranade has also asked a question, so maybe I will just read out. You can keep it out. I can read it again if necessary. Mr. Ajit Ranade's question is how to explain the rise of Kejriwal. His party has won thrice without appeal to caste, religion, and without spending big money. Is this model of capturing power replicable, or does power have to necessarily be the continuance of economic and political power? What role political party finance and reform? These are generally the set of questions that Ajit Ranade has raised, but I will stop here.
Thank you. First of all, on democracy, I'm an optimist. I'm a firm believer that Indian democracy has survived many tests. It will survive future tests. Nobody can dethrone Indian democracy. Um, we are going through a period of stress. The assertion of Hindu majoritarianism by the BJP is a period of stress. We have gone through a period of stress in the past. But the basic structure of democratic institutions will survive all these stresses. Now, you can ask the question, how meaningful is this democracy? Of course, I myself said we live in a plutocracy. The rich have come to take control of the instruments of democracy, and that is only becoming more and more. Money has become the route to power, and power has become the route to money, and that is not going to change. So that is true for many democracies. I mean, United States also, the wealthy have an edge over everybody else when it comes to winning elections. But in a pure constitutional sense, I don't think Indian democracy will ever be replaced by a non-democratic system. For a variety of reasons, I don't have to get into that detail, but if you want me to elaborate, I can do a little later. Digital elite is an issue. It's a major issue. One of the negative consequences of the lockdown in this 1.5 years is, in fact, this great digital divide between those who have access to this Zoom, those who have access to the net, and those who do not have. It's a serious problem. We have created a generation of young children who become conscious of this digital divide. In what way it will shape their attitudes in the future remains to be seen. But if we do not reverse this and return to schools, return to more egalitarian education system, I think this is going to be a serious issue. We fancy ourselves by saying, oh, everybody, 800 million mobile phones. From mobile phone, you can access everything, etc. But the fact is that mobile phones are used mainly for entertainment, or for services in urban areas. But it has not become an instrument for reducing income disparities as yet. There are these stories about how vegetable vendors can now call you and sell vegetables by phoning you, etc. But these are all marginal stories. But I do think digital divide in a country where only 4-5% of the population are able to actually afford a lot of these services is a serious problem. On Ajit's question, I also saw it on the chat box. Arvind Kejriwal. Look, Ajit, I think the point, first of all, is that he's not an exception in the sense that there are other regional parties which have come to power through use of other appeals. For example, in Bengal, recently we saw Bengali nationalism. It was not caste, it was not religion, but a regional kind of sentiment. We saw that in Telangana with the Telangana kind of sentiment. So there are other sentiments that have come to be used. And the left in Kerala, again, a regional party that has been able to retain power using more secular political appeal. Kejriwal is an interesting phenomenon when it comes to Delhi elections, not at the parliament yet. Because in the parliament elections in 2014 and 19, the BJP swept. But in the assembly elections, he has won. And he has won, in my judgment. I live in Delhi. I've seen the last 2 elections because the class consciousness has gone up in Delhi. The rich-poor divide is sharper in Delhi than ever before. Unlike even Bombay or Calcutta, the rich and the poor live apart. And the services available in the areas where the poor live and the services where the rich live are stark. And apart from the areas where the rich live, there is the central Delhi, the Lutyens Delhi, where the politically powerful live. So Kejriwal's constituency are the poor, who live outside this Lutyens Delhi, outside South Delhi, and who live across this vast expanse of a growing Delhi, where essentially lower middle class poor people. And so the politics of Kejriwal is at the moment class politics. Beyond that, I'm not as familiar. Maybe Dr. Palshikar may have some thoughts on that question. Let me stop there.
Okay. There is a question by Anirudh Datta. The transition that we are witnessing in the society today, how does it play out in the society? Do you see a lot of tensions? That's one question. Surendra Agarwal has asked this question. Do you think power will shift from big companies to startups? And then maybe we can read out the third question as well by Dinabandhu Patra. How do you see the transition of the vision that the power elites have as a society, about India as a society and as a state? What is the transition in their ideas and ideals as India becomes more middle class, more urban and more affluent?
Well, first of all, these are questions more about the future.
Yes.
And a bit speculative, so my views would be as good as your views. They don't flow from the book as such. But let me briefly reply to these questions. First of all, in fact, as Professor Palshikar correctly observed, I end the book with a little speculative analysis about the nature of the tensions emerging in society and the way in which the current political ruling party is seeking to address them. And I pose this as a question, partly to provoke my reader, because I don't want to give the answer. The answer is, in my judgment, there in the book, but I don't pose it as an answer. So what is the question? The question I'm posing is, we are seeing a transition happening. This attack on Lutyens, Delhi, Hindutva, etc. How much of this transition really reflects genuine change, and how much of it is an attempt to control? In other words, is the increasing role of religion and politics a reflection of the increasing appeal of religion to the people, or is it an instrument used in order to subjugate people, to prevent them from being mobilized along other lines, whether it's class or caste? So you deal with social tension, as the first questioner asked, whether it's tension based on class differences or caste differences, by building a narrative around religion. So you unite Hindus so that that agenda prevents a sharpening contradictions along class lines and caste lines. My answer to that question is yes, I think that's precisely what is happening. But since I don't discuss it in any great detail, I've left it as a question. But I think that is the direction in which we are moving. And this is not unique. You look at many countries around the world, and here you read Gramsci, you read analysis of the politics of Latin American countries, the rise of the Catholic Church, the rise of Islam in the Arab world, where religion has always been used to suppress class distinctions or class-based mobilization. In fact, Iran is a classic example of a country where the Ayatollahs came to power killing the communists, eliminating any class-based mobilization. And that we have seen in many Latin American countries. We have seen in many African countries. And that's the attempt even in the United States with Donald Trump, asserting Christian values, white supremacy, in order to deal with the genuine problem the United States is having of increasing inequality, which is what Biden and the black leadership is addressing. So rising inequality is a global challenge, and we have seen Thomas Piketty's work on rising inequalities globally, and certainly in India, inequality is rising. And when inequality rises, class and caste tensions will rise. But how do you suppress those tensions? You use religion or you use external enemies. External enemies always are used as a way of uniting a country. Big company startups are nowhere near influencing the politics of this country. political parties are owned by big business or big business is owned by political parties. Politicians are hand in glove. The only journalist, only person who has had the courage to write some of this was Josie Joseph. I refer to his book called The Vultures, The Feast of Vultures, where he brings out very clearly how Jet Airways was owned by certain political leaders. And people know today who owns what, which politician owns what. So big business and big politics is together. Startups, I wish all of them good luck, but I don't think they're yet in a position to unseat the power of big business. Finally, on the vision, well, I don't know. I mean, I don't think the Indian elite actually have a vision for India's future. Now, I don't discuss this in the book, so it's not based on my book, but this is my personal view. I think the vision with which the generation of the post-independence generation brought India to where it is today is certainly lacking. Because we see two phenomena. One is a phenomenon I discuss in the book. And very interestingly, that is one chapter that has attracted the least attention in all the reviews in the media in the last 2 months that my book has been around. Very few people have really discussed, and there must be some Freudian explanation, which is a chapter which is titled Secession of the Successful. The Indian elite are seceding. And every other day in the media, you have more and more evidence of this. What is the first thing the government says after the lockdown is lifted? All those who are going abroad for studying, they'll be given special preference for vaccination. The US Embassy says we are having more staff to quickly give visas, right? The number of schools, and the data is there in that chapter on secession of the successful, number of schools that have been set up, including in Pune and around Pune. 137 schools that give a degree called IB, International Baccalaureate. It's not a degree that any Indian university demands for admission to graduate studies. But that's a degree that can get you out of India across the world. Thousands of students are going out. In fact, billions of dollars. I have the numbers in the book. One number I can remember from memory, in the period from 2009 to 2014, 5 years, every year, the money going out on account of one of the entries in the RBI ledger for education abroad and maintenance of relatives abroad was $1 billion per year. From 2014 to 19, it has gone up to $11 billion per year. So from 1 billion per year to 11 billion per year. You can imagine phenomenal increase in the amount of money that the Indian elite are using to just get out of India. Businessmen. In the old days, they used to be told that businessmen are the last people who leave the country because their property is here. Over the last 15, 20 years, we have allowed them to own property in India but live abroad. So one of the consequences of COVID is that a large number of Indian businessmen now live in Dubai or in London and operate their companies in India. Doesn't get reported, but you get a little few. I think Economic Times is the only paper that has put out some data on this. A lot of them living abroad and running business in India. Thousands of Indians in Singapore running companies out of India, right? So the elite is seceding. So whose vision are we talking of?
Yeah, Dr. Baru, since you spoke so passionately and critically about the Delhi Darbar, here is an interesting question by Jaideep Kalgutkar. In the business world, we often see the third generation blowing up their business. How long do you think can political dynasties last?
Well, the fourth generation, the Congress party has already undone the party. The third generation didn't have much time, but the undoing of the party started during Rajiv's time. If you see the data for the 1980 elections, 84 elections, 89 elections, it was during Rajiv's time that the BJP made its major gains. Even in the case of that dynasty, and I don't think any other political dynasty has yet gone into third generation. Professor Parshikar, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think most dynasties are into second generation, whether it is Karunanidhi or Mulayam or Lalu or Sharad Pawar. They're all into second generation. The third generation has not yet come into being. And already in the second generation, the power of the family is going down. So I think business families have endured more than political families.
In Tamil Nadu and in Maharashtra, you might probably be witnessing the rise of the third generations in the case of Thackeray's and in the case of the Karunanidhis. But yes,
Stalin is still second generation.
Stalin is, but he is sort of supporting the next generation as well. But anyway, yeah. Then there is this question. Pradeep Kumar, how does the increasing religious divide impact existing elites functioning?
No, the elite come from the majority community. In fact, that's one shortcoming in my book, that I do not discuss at all what is happening within the Muslim community. Because in the Muslim community too, there is an elite and there is the non-elite. And the phenomenon is quite interesting. Maybe when I rework my book for the future, I will introduce a chapter. What is the phenomenon? Immediately after independence, a majority of the Muslim elite left India. They went to Pakistan and subsequently out of Pakistan to UK and US and Dubai, etc. Leaving behind only the poor. So all over northern India, it's the poor who are left behind, or the feudal elements because of land. But the elite itself, Muslim elite in the northern India, went out. In southern India, again, the really top elite, I mean, Hyderabad, I come from Hyderabad. In the Hyderabad state, the really rich also migrated. They left and mostly went first to Pakistan, but within 5-10 years, they all left Pakistan and went off to Britain, Australia, USA, etc. But in the southern states, those who were left behind, particularly the Muslim middle class, invested in education and training and benefited enormously from the Middle East Gulf boom. So Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Maharashtra, you see that the Gulf migration and Gulf employment opportunities have allowed them to become economically secure. So if you come to my home city of Hyderabad, you'll see a large number of upper middle class Muslims today owning businesses, living in very good homes in upmarket areas, running computer classes, running properties, etc. So there is Kerala certainly that has happened. So there is an economic improvement within the Muslim community. Now, all of this I did not discuss in my book. Maybe at some point I will add another chapter. But looking at what is happening within the minorities.
I think there was this question on the religious divide making an impact on elites functioning.
Yeah, so as I said, my book.
There is also a related question, probably by Aniruddha Datta again. He's saying, given aspirations of people, if economic growth and aspirations are not met with, will appeal to religion fade instead of getting consolidated? So both related to the question of religion in a way.
No, I don't think religion can survive if the economy doesn't pick up. I've written this. This has been my view for some time, that the focus has to be on the economy, particularly now. Because of COVID, there's been a sharp increase in unemployment. There's been a sharp increase in poverty. There's a sharp increase in inequality. So the economic disparities, economic opportunities have gone down. And unless economic momentum is restored, unless people see hope in the future, that they're likely to get jobs, or their children are likely to get jobs, that life is going to get better, that hope has to be restored. Purely, hoping that on the basis of religious symbols, elections can be won again and again, I don't think that will happen. At least that is my hopeful view, that unless the current economic decline is reversed, this kind of politics cannot survive for long. And in countries where it has survived, the move has been towards authoritarianism. using ideology as a weapon to become more authoritarian. But again, here, I don't think in India authoritarian works. I mean, we have had a laboratory experiment in Kashmir where authoritarianism was tried for the last 2 years. And finally, what are we doing? We are going back to the same politicians and saying, please come back and contest and let us have some election, some democratic symbolism, some elected legislature. Please, accept we are giving you an opportunity because you need legitimacy. The regime reasons. So I don't think we can run away from, using pure force to run this country.
To slightly distract you from this question about religion, there is a subtitle to your book, Class, Caste and a Cultural Revolution. And ever since I started reading the book, I was intrigued. How does Mao sit with Searite mills? And I was reminded of this because you mentioned Gramsci. And I thought that wouldn't it be more appropriate to actually bring in the questions that Gramsci raises, and you mentioned them in answers also. Why were you sort of attracted to cultural revolution analogy? Was it because of the rupture that the Modi movement brings, or is there any other reason behind that?
Well, for two reasons. One, the Cultural Revolution in China essentially destabilized the Beijing elite. And that was the point I was making, that what Modi has done, which even Vajpayee did not do, was to seek to destabilize the Lutyens elite. So in that sense, that the metaphor of the Cultural Revolution was that here you have a political phenomenon where the Delhi elite, like the Beijing elite, is being destabilized. Of course, in China, Mao went to the other extreme of actually sending everybody out to the villages and etc. But in India, we have not gone to the other extreme, but pushing people out. So I give you examples of reconstitution of the Nehru Memorial Museum, JNU being taken over by the RSS cadre, institutions in Delhi increasingly under siege, and that this is very similar to what the Gang of Four tried to do. So that's one reason why I felt the metaphor of the Cultural Revolution tries to explain what is happening, particularly in the first term. I mean, particularly about last year. But the second reason is the anti-intellectualism that we associate with the Chinese Cultural Revolution. It was a huge setback. Books were burned. I mean, in a country like China, which is a highly educated country, where scholarship has always had a very high this thing, and today is extremely in terms of education developed country. But there was a very severe onslaught and the anti-intellectualism of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, and that is precisely what we are seeing in Delhi, with Modi and his crowd. I mean, when I was Secretary General of FICCI, I had to go and meet the Minister of State for Education. It was a revealing experience for me. He was a retired police officer, in fact, I think from Maharashtra, who had become a member of parliament and become a Minister of State for Education. I was completely shocked at the half an hour I spent sitting in front of him, at the kind of things he said to me. I said, if he is in charge of education in this country, then we are going to go back. So maybe that weighed a lot in my mind, those kind of experiences, than what was happening in JNU. You got a, utterly incompetent, anti-intellectual vice chancellor, making a mockery of higher education in India's one of the best universities. So maybe those experiences kind of influenced me. But I certainly saw a parallel to what the Gang of Four tried to do in China. And fortunately, China was rescued from that.
But then do you see that this new set of transformation or elite that are now sort of situating themselves in corridors of power, will they have the capacity to counter the elite permanently, or do you think that this is only a moment? Because in your book you conclude finally about the question of change and the speed of change, which I thought are very important questions, that in India at least, we go through gradualism rather than this kind of ruptures when genuine changes take place.
Yes, Professor Palshikar. I mean, it's a question and still in my mind because events are happening, and certainly in the last 1 year, several events have happened to suggest that the initial kind of thrust has slowed down. But the point really is that you have an ideologically driven movement that has acquired power, which is not being challenged by another ideological movement. I mean, that is the failure of the Indian National Congress or the Sonia Congress or the Rahul Congress, and certainly of all the regional parties, that they are not mounting an ideological challenge. In fact, if anything, they're all succumbing to the dominant ideology. I mean, when the Congress party wants to be more Hindu than the BJP in the way in which. So I think the first time we saw an ideological challenge was from the DMK in Tamil Nadu and Mamata Banerjee in Bengal. Really the first time, in my judgment, in the last 7 years. They are the ones who challenged in ideological terms. Whether we agree with their ideology or not, I mean, the Dravidian ideology in Tamil Nadu and the Bengali nationalism in Bengal, whether one goes along with it and how long it can function, work against Hindutva, I don't know. But at least it was an ideological challenge. It was not succumbing to the BJP, but standing up to the BJP. But there is no other challenge. And the Congress certainly has not been able to come out with an ideological positioning that is able to challenge the BJP.
In political science, generally this discussion has been going on about the question of regionalism and whether it helps the dominant party or it helps the regional local parties only. Would you think that the BJP would be able to incorporate regional identities in what it is currently doing?
Yes, it can, because after all, the Congress also did that. The Congress did that as long as the regional leaders do not challenge the national leader.
Mm-hmm.
That was a settlement in the Congress, that we will not question Indira Gandhi in Delhi or Rajiv Gandhi in Delhi or Sonia Gandhi in Delhi, as long as we are left alone in our state. So a lot of Congress leaders survived, as long as they were the bosses in their own area. Something to that effect is happening in the BJP. We see a tension between Adityanath and the central leadership, between in Madhya Pradesh and Karnataka, between Yadurappa and the central leader. The regional leaders are asserting themselves. And their argument is that, look, you stay in Delhi, you run, you Modi, Amit Shah, you be in Delhi. We will be here. And you can't move us around like Indira Gandhi tried to do with Anjaya or Narasimha. That is no longer acceptable. If you do that, then we will do to you what Mamata did to them or what Sharad Pawar did, which is we'll form a regional party. So we will go the regional way. It's an interesting tension. In Uttarakhand, they were able to make this change. But the person who was removed in Uttarakhand has already spoken out. And how that politics will develop remains to be seen. But at the end of the day, we have to respect the wisdom of the constitutional authors of our constitution. They began the Indian constitution with the first sentence that said, India, that is Bharat, is a union of states.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And political leaders who forget that there is a union of states do great harm to the country. The other day, a BJP leader said, no, states are nothing. It's the central government is the states are the creation of the center. I actually saw in some newspaper, some BJP fellow saying, states are the creation of center. No, that route is dangerous. that route is dangerous because then the country will balkanize.
Whether, and this is last from my side, otherwise we can then conclude. Whether it is the question of region versus or unity versus regionalism, federalism, etc., or the questions of religious divide, why is there a silence from our economic elite, the industrial and business elite? One answer, of course, could simply be that there is a crony capitalism and therefore you don't have any possibility of a counter by them. But at the same time, I suspect somewhere that there is something fundamentally wrong about the way in which Indian capital is structured or composed of. And it is not merely their dependence on the state, but their overall approach to the constitution that you were talking about just a minute ago, which is something somewhat suspect. And therefore, when such fundamental issues emerge in our country, whether it is emergency 50 years, 4 decades ago, or religious divide today, or regional questions today, they generally keep silence rather than taking up sides. Indian capital generally doesn't, in that sense, meddle in politics. Why would that be? Is there a nexus or is there a disjunction between the two?
Sir, there are several answers to your question.
I know, I'm just...
It's an interesting question for me because briefly I had to deal with this issue.
Mhm.
I was Secretary General of FICCI for about a year and then quit, partly because I had to deal with this whole question. First and foremost, a large section of Indian business are crony capitalists. In other words, their dependence on the state is critical, whether it's financial dependence or political dependence, or the fact that they've done so many things which either the IT fellows or the enforcement directorate or some other agency of the state can go after them. Short of leaving the country, like Vijay Mallya has done or Mehul Choksi have done, short of leaving the country, there is no escape from the Indian state for a large majority of Indian business. Second reason is that, and I've actually made a reference to this in my book, quoting one businessman who said to me that we are not happy with the government, but then at the end of the day, I'm Hindu first and businessman second. I've actually quoted him in the book. As a very senior businessman, I don't want to name him, but a very senior businessman said, I'm not happy with the government, but at the end of the day, I'm Hindu first and businessman second. So and these are all upper caste Indian business. Finally, there is a certain element of feudal subjugation to authority. I give an example in the book and leave it at that. When I joined FICCI as Secretary General, I found that every letter that was being addressed by the organization to any minister referred to the minister as Honorable Minister. And the practice in the organization was that all letters had to be signed by the Secretary General. So irrespective of who in the organization addressed a letter, it used to come to me for signature. And I would send it back to the person drafting the letter saying, why are you saying Honorable Minister? The fellow is not honorable. Just say Mr. Minister. In Britain, the Prime Minister is referred to as Mr. Prime Minister. In the US, the President is referred to as Mr. President. So why are we referring to all these fellows as honorable all the time? Just say, dear Mr. Minister or Madam Minister. You won't believe it. The amount of resistance to that suggestion, not just from business members of FICCI, but from even my staff. No, sir. Minister will get offended. So this feudal kind of subjugation to authority and power. So it's a combination of all of this that makes Indian business so subservient. It doesn't have its own legs to stand on.
Okay, I think we should sort of move towards the conclusion, but I then see here at least one question by Mr. Girish Tatke. So we'll just take up that and then conclude. I think one is addressed to me probably. How do you see the political science academics and other practitioners influencing the situation? So nil is the answer, but but then the continuation is in the context of your comment of business leaders keeping quiet. Do you see any think tank being able to influence the outcome in positive manner? In a sense, you have answered this, but if you want to sort of supplement your answer further.
No, I mean, either most of our think tanks are funded by government or business.
Yeah,
So where is that independence?
sure.
Which is why public universities are important. Autonomous, publicly funded autonomous universities. I mean, our
But there also vice chancellors are addressed as
Yeah,
honorable
exactly.
vice chancellor.
No, exactly. That is why the tragedy of public education. But they're important, and defending the public space is important. But you're right. I mean, there you have all kinds of chaps now, police officers as vice chancellors in
Yes.
many states. IPS officers have been made vice chancellors.
I think Dr. Vijay Kelkar is sort of raring to say something.
Yes, no, I just want to respond to the last question because it relates to think tank, and we are speaking at the Pune International Center, which we are style ourselves a think tank. But there are think tanks, maybe smaller ones like ours, which are entirely funded by the members themselves. We don't have any single penny on the government. We've got about 450 individual members and 55 academic institutions who pay for the foundation. So, so far at least we have been able to maintain independence, and that is the whole purpose for this. So I thought I'd just mention it for the benefit of all the listeners and also my dear friend Dr. Baru, because probably he may not be aware the financing part of PIC is entirely financed by the members themselves. So, but last point I just want to give my 2 bits before what is worth. I have much simpler understanding about power elite of India, and I don't think there's much change, because I do believe the real hero of India's story is really Indian bourgeoisie, national bourgeoisie. They still control. They played an important role. They led the national movement, and they are also leading our modernization of India. And they keep on shifting the alliances with domestic other classes, especially peasantry, depending on what the international contradictions are. So I think it's the same thing continues. So power really remains same, they're alive and well, and which is really Indian national bourgeoisie. They're the leader, and they use bureaucracy, they use all other sort of partners, junior partners, but the main is led by national bourgeoisie. But this is my very simple-minded formulation, Professor.
Okay, thank you. So with the permission of the organizer and the main speaker, can I just conclude and hand over to Abhay for the vote of thanks in a couple of minutes?
Sure.
Please, sir, please.
Yeah. As I said earlier also, there is no need to sort of round off the discussion that we had so far, because there are so many openings that the discussion sort of brought about. And that was quite natural given the nature of the book. The book does not speak only about politics, though we sort of get swayed quickly by political personalities. The book speaks about power. And the single most important point probably that this eminently readable book makes is this, that power is multifaceted, that power resides somewhere else, and you probably can't put your finger on it. The moment you think that you have known where power resides, you find that power is residing somewhere else as well. And then you are, in a sense, in a helpless situation to bring all these threads together. That's one thing about this book. The other thing, and that is not a fault of this book, but the fault of our power grid or our composition of power in our country, our society, which is that we don't speak and Dr. Baru himself mentioned about the Muslims. We don't speak about Muslims, but we also don't speak about Dalits much. There is a mention of Dikhi in your book, of course, but our power grid still doesn't have space for a number of communities and social sections. Dalits and Adivasis, of course, are beyond the pale of this question of power. But even women are beyond this pale of question of power. And in that sense, the power elite and the phenomenon of power in India is extremely skewed. Now, one may argue sociologically that power is always skewed and you don't have symmetrical distribution of power in society. One may also argue that mirror representation is not enough, etc. In spite of all this, I think this book is a reminder in not saying this because it doesn't talk about these social sections because they don't matter for our power considerations. And that is actually a sad comment which we should take along with this book. The second thing which this book probably hints at but doesn't talk much about is that yes, composition may change, but we don't know whether the ways in which power operates and if dominance and oppression are two key ways in which power is witnessed and experienced by citizens, then that remains as a constant. We might talk of democracy, we might talk of democratization of power, but power is hard to get democratized. And therefore, the constant tussle between democracy and power will have to be there. And unless we understand this, and if we get satisfied merely by the social composition of power, we would probably be doing a great disservice to theory and politics of democracy in our midst. I will stop here. Thank you, Dr. Baru, very much for being in our midst. But that is something which Abhay is also going to say. And thank you very much for having me to sort of converse with you. Thank you.
Before Abhay comes on, let me thank you, sir. I'm a great
No,
and I've really enjoyed this interaction with you. I'm grateful that you read my book. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Palshikar. It is my honor to present this vote of thanks to both you, Dr. Baru, and Dr. Palshikar for this fascinating and deeply thought-provoking discussion on the changing character of the Indian political elite and its implications. Dr. Baru, you spoke about a number of issues, the secession of the moneyed class through education and business, the Delhi Darbar of national politics, and how it is different from the regional politics which Professor Palshikar spoke about. Your optimism in the strength of Indian democracy is very heartening. And Dr. Palshikar, your observation that this change in the nature of political elite predates the Modi era found echo in the viewer comments that we have received. I just want to share a small anecdote. I recall that while covering Western Maharashtra politics, we had heard of how Vasant Dada Patil deeply regretted not knowing English. And we also knew of the enormous efforts that Sharad Pawar took to learn English as he entered national politics and as he rose in national politics. So before closing, I want to thank my colleagues Kiran and Amresh for their back-end support. And I also want to mention that our next event is on 5th July. This is on the book by Dr. Ganesh Natarajan and Dr. Uma Natarajan, Accelerating Digital Success, Reimagining Organizations for a Post-COVID-19 World. Dr. Mashelkar will be in the chair, and the host for this event is Dr. Ranade, Dr. Ajit Ranade, who will be in conversation with the authors and with Dr. Mashelkar. So please do attend this event on 5th July at 5 p.m. The link will be available on the PIC website. With this, I would like to say thanks to all our participants, to all our viewers for their very interesting questions and this fascinating discussion. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye. And we'll be in touch, Sanjay.
Certainly, I look forward to that. Thank
Thank
you, Dr.
you,